They cleared my office in front of everyone and handed it to a new hire who hadn't survived a single busy quarter. No warning, no meeting, just a smile, a box, and someone else sitting at my desk by lunchtime. After years of keeping the operation running quietly, I was told to be flexible and move out the same hour. What they didn't realize was how much depended on me showing up that afternoon. If you've ever been pushed aside after doing everything right, this story will sound familiar. Stay with me. Subscribe if workplace betrayals hit close to home, and tell me in the comments if something like this ever happened to you. Late that morning, HR walked straight into my office without knocking, carrying a banker's box like this was a routine errand. Monica from HR didn't smile. She set the box down on my desk, right next to my keyboard, and said, "We're going to need this office today." Behind her stood a man I'd never seen before, neatly dressed, confident, already glancing at the windows like he was checking the view. "This is Adrian," she added. "He'll be using this space going forward." I waited for an explanation. None came. Adrian stepped closer and said, "I appreciate you making this easy." That was when I understood this wasn't a discussion. I asked, "Who approved this?" Monica tapped her tablet and replied, "The COO signed off this morning." No meeting, no warning, no transition. People slowed as they passed my door, pretending not to stare. Adrian reached for the nameplate on my desk and said, almost casually, "Facilities can swap this out later." I picked it up myself and placed it in the box. Monica began removing items from my shelves without asking. My framed photos, a notebook, a paperweight I'd had for years. "You can finish packing later," she said. "We're on a timeline." I asked, "Where am I supposed to work?" She answered, "There's an open desk near operations. It's temporary." Temporary was the word they always used when they wanted compliance, not agreement. I stood up, stepped back, and watched as someone else occupied my chair. That was the humiliation, clear and final, delivered in front of witnesses. I picked up my badge, set it gently inside the box, and walked out. No one stopped me. No one said a word. I rode the elevator down alone and kept walking until I reached the parking garage. I sat in my car and didn't turn the engine on. Early that afternoon, the first call came in. I didn't look at the screen. Then another, then another. The phone buzzed in my hand like something alive. When I finally answered, the voice on the other end skipped pleasantries. "Do you know why the numbers aren't clearing?" I said nothing. Another call cut in before I could hang up. "We can't close today's cycle. The approvals aren't moving." I leaned back and stared at the concrete wall in front of me. A third call came through, this time from the COO's assistant. I answered. "Where are you?" she asked. "Not in my office," I replied. She lowered her voice. "We're about to start the review." I said calmly, "You reassigned my authority when you reassigned my office." There was a pause. Then she said, "Things are stuck." That was the second marker, the moment the shift began. I looked up at the building, the same floor where someone else was now sitting at my desk, assuming control he didn't understand. "That happens," I said, "when decisions are made without considering who actually holds things together." She asked carefully, "Can you come back up?" I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. "I'll think about it," I said, "after the review starts." I ended the call and set the phone down. Inside that building, a meeting was about to begin without the person who made it work. Outside, I stayed exactly where I was, knowing they had crossed a line they couldn't uncross, and that the consequences were already unfolding whether they admitted it or not. I didn't go back inside, and I didn't explain myself to anyone. I stayed in the garage long enough to watch the first wave of executives arrive, walking faster than usual, folders tucked tight under their arms, faces already tense. When I finally drove home, I left my phone face down on the passenger seat. It buzzed the entire way. I didn't need to hear the messages to know the tone had changed. By the time I reached my driveway, the silence inside the house felt heavier than the noise I'd left behind. I poured a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, letting the day unfold without me. That was the point. For years, everything had moved because I moved it. Now it would move, or not, on its own. Mid-afternoon, I checked my voicemail once. Operations wanted to know why approvals weren't clearing. Finance was asking why end-of-day numbers hadn't reconciled. A regional manager I trusted left a short message. They're scrambling. No one knows who's allowed to decide anything. I deleted none of it. I also didn't respond. I wasn't being dramatic. I was being precise. If I stepped back in too soon, they'd call it a misunderstanding. If I explained myself, they'd call it emotion. I needed them to sit inside the consequences without me softening the edges. Later, I learned how the review actually went. Adrian took my chair and opened his laptop like he belonged there. He walked through slides he hadn't built, metrics he didn't fully understand, answers he assumed would come to him because they always had before. When questions started coming, he deflected. When follow-ups came, he promised to circle back. When someone asked why approvals were frozen, he said the process was being streamlined, that word again. Streamlined. It sounded good until someone asked who had final sign-off authority now. No one answered. The guy looked at each other. The room went quiet in the wrong way. By the time the meeting ended, nothing had been decided and several things had quietly broken. Outside the room, people started whispering. Not about me, but about the gap I'd left. The assistants noticed first, then the managers, then the people who had spent years dropping issues on my desk because they trusted they'd disappear by morning. That trust had nowhere to go now. I spent the evening doing something I hadn't done in years. Nothing. No emails, no late calls, no last-minute fixes. I cooked dinner, I cleaned the kitchen, I went to bed early, I slept through the night. The next morning, I woke up to a single message marked urgent. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't an explanation, it was a question. Can you clarify how this is supposed to work now? That was when I knew the story they'd told themselves was already collapsing. They hadn't replaced me. They'd removed a load-bearing wall and assumed the ceiling would hold. I didn't answer right away. I showered, I got dressed, I made coffee. I let them wait inside the uncertainty they'd created. I wasn't angry. I wasn't hurt. I was done making things easier for people who had decided I was optional. I didn't return their calls, but I did start paying attention, not to the noise, but to the pattern. One message came from a senior manager asking who could authorize a temporary override, another from finance asking why a routine adjustment hadn't posted overnight, a third from someone in logistics who never contacted me directly unless something was already broken. None of them sounded angry. They sounded uncertain, which was worse. That uncertainty spread quickly once people realized there was no longer a quiet final stop where decisions landed. By late morning, word had traveled without anyone formally saying it. Things weren't moving because no one knew who had the authority to move them. Adrian tried to fill the gap by calling impromptu meetings, pulling people into conference rooms, asking for status updates he couldn't interpret. He spoke confidently, but confidence doesn't unlock processes. It doesn't replace judgment built over years of watching what happens when you say yes too fast or no too late. At some point that day, someone escalated an issue that should have been resolved in minutes. Instead, it bounced between inboxes for hours. Every reply added another person, another opinion, another delay. By the time it reached the executive floor, the problem had grown teeth. I learned later that the COO asked, flat out, why something so small had turned into a blockage. No one had an answer. They had explanations, but not answers. Meanwhile, people started doing what they always did when the system failed. They looked for me. My name came up in side conversations, not as a threat, just as a fact. She would have known. She wouldn't have let this sit. She always caught this, before it became a problem. That wasn't loyalty. That was recognition of function. The organization had been leaning on me without realizing it, and now it was leaning on air. Midday, a decision landed that Adrian approved without understanding the downstream effect. It wasn't reckless. It was incomplete. The result was immediate. A dependent process stalled, then another, then a third. By the time someone noticed, reversing it would have required authority no one was willing to claim. The phrase, "let's wait," started appearing in messages. Waiting is expensive when momentum matters. By that afternoon, the COO called an emergency huddle. I wasn't invited. No one needed to tell me how it went. I could hear it in the tone of the messages that followed. Shorter, tighter, less certain. Someone finally asked the question they'd been avoiding all day. Can we bring her back in to help stabilize this? It wasn't framed as an apology. It was framed as a resource request, which told me everything I needed to know about how they still saw me. I didn't respond, not because I was punishing them, but because the moment wasn't ripe yet. If I stepped in then, I'd be a patch, temporary, useful until things calmed down, then quietly sidelined again. I needed the failure to finish revealing itself. That evening, a decision was delayed that had knock-on effects no one had modeled. The delay triggered another delay. People stayed late trying to fix what they didn't fully understand. Adrian stayed later, answering questions with reassurances that sounded thinner each time. At home, I watched it unfold through the gaps people didn't realize they were leaving in their messages. You can tell when control is slipping not by the size of the problems, but by how often people ask permission instead of making decisions. Late that night, my phone rang. I didn't answer. A message followed, this one from the COO directly. It was short. No greeting, no explanation, just a request to talk. I read it once and set the phone down. This wasn't about pride. It was about leverage. They had made a public decision without me. Now they needed to understand what that decision had actually cost. The shift wasn't complete yet, but it was visible. The center of gravity had moved, and everyone in the building could feel it, even if no one wanted to say it out loud. I agreed to talk once it became clear the situation had stopped being theoretical. There was a difference between inconvenience and exposure, and they had crossed into the second without realizing it. The COO called me that afternoon. I didn't rush to answer. When I did, I kept my voice neutral, like we were discussing a routine update instead of a system coming apart. He didn't start with an apology. He started with urgency. "We need clarity," he said. I let that sit for a moment before responding. Clarity about what? There was a pause, then a careful choice of words. About how things were handled. That told me they still didn't want to name the mistake out loud. I didn't help him. "You reassigned my office, my authority, and my access," I said. "I assumed that meant you also reassigned responsibility." He said my name the way people do when they're trying to soften a hard turn. "That wasn't the intent." I replied, "Intent doesn't keep operations moving." He shifted tactics. He talked about alignment, about optics, about the need to show decisiveness. I listened without interrupting, not because I agreed, but because I wanted him to hear how thin it sounded when nothing was working. When he finished, I asked one question. "Who has final say right now?" He didn't answer immediately. That was my answer. He tried again, this time more directly. "Can you come in and help us stabilize?" I said, "Help is vague." Another pause. Then, "What would it take?" That was the opening, and he knew it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list grievances. I stated conditions. My authority has to be explicit, not implied. Decisions tied to my function can't be overridden without my sign-off. And if I'm responsible for outcomes, I need the space and access that responsibility requires. He started to push back, then stopped himself. "We can discuss scope," he said. I replied, "Scope is the discussion." He asked if this was about the office. I said, "The office is a signal. Signals matter." He exhaled slowly, like someone realizing the negotiation had already started and they were behind. "We're under pressure," he said. I answered, "So am I." He asked if I was threatening to walk away. I said, "I already did." That landed. The tone changed after that. Less corporate, more careful. He asked what it would take to bring me back into the building. I told him I'd send a summary, not a proposal, a summary. When we hung up, I wrote it in 3 short points and sent it over. No justifications, no history, just structure, authority, reporting, space. The response came back faster than I expected. "We need to review this with leadership." I replied, "Take your time. Things seem to be moving slowly without me anyway." I didn't enjoy that line, but it was accurate. I spent the rest of the day doing nothing that helped them. No hints, no side conversations, no back channels. If they wanted me back, it had to be on terms that couldn't be quietly undone later. By the end of the day, another message came through. "Can you come in tomorrow morning?" I read it once. I didn't answer right away. The power shift wasn't complete yet, but it was close. They had stopped asking me to help and started asking me to return. That difference mattered more than anything else they could have offered. I returned the next morning without announcement and without hesitation, walking through the lobby like I had never left, because functionally, I hadn't. The first thing I noticed was how quiet the floor had become. Not empty, just restrained, as if everyone was waiting for permission they didn't have. People looked up when they saw me, then quickly backed down at their screens, unsure whether acknowledging me was allowed yet. I didn't stop to reassure anyone. That wasn't my job anymore. I went straight to the executive floor, past the shared desks they'd offered me, past the conference rooms where conversations had stalled, and into the office that used to be mine. Adrian was still there. He stood up when he saw me, too quickly, knocking his chair back. "I wasn't told you were coming in today," he said. I nodded. That makes sense. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain myself. I simply set my bag down on the desk and said, "You'll want to move your things." He hesitated, then looked toward the glass wall, where the COO and two others were already watching. No one intervened. That was all the confirmation I needed. Adrian gathered his laptop and left without another word. I closed the door behind him and sat down, opening my computer like it had never been shut. Within minutes, messages started coming in, not panicked this time, but focused. Questions became specific. Requests came with context instead of urgency. That shift told me the conditions had already been communicated. I didn't announce my authority. I exercised it. The first thing I did was clear a backlog no one else had touched. Not because it was complex, but because it required judgment instead of consensus. I approved some items, rejected others, and sent a few back with single-line notes. People responded immediately. That was the difference. Mid-morning, the COO came in without knocking, stopped short when he saw me settled, then nodded once. "We're aligned," he said. I replied, "We'll see." He gestured toward the chair across from me and sat without waiting. "Leadership agreed to your terms," he said. "Reporting, access, authority." I didn't ask for the details. If they were incomplete, I'd find out soon enough. "What about the interim structure?" I asked. He paused. "Adrian will be reporting through you." I nodded. That was appropriate. "He's capable," the COO added quickly, like he needed to say it out loud. I said, "Capability isn't the issue." I didn't elaborate. He shifted the conversation toward moving forward, toward stabilization, toward messaging. I let him talk until he ran out of things to say. Then I told him what would happen next. Not suggestions, not requests. What would happen? Who would handle what? Which decisions would come to me? Which ones wouldn't? He listened, and for the first time since this started, he didn't interrupt. When he left, the glass wall felt different, less like a display, more like a boundary. I spent the rest of the day doing the work they'd underestimated, quiet corrections, preventive adjustments, conversations that didn't make it into meeting notes but changed outcomes anyway. Adrian came back once, hovering in the doorway. "I wasn't sure where to sit," he said. I pointed to the desk outside. "There," I said. He nodded and didn't argue. That mattered. By the end of the day, the noise had died down. Not because the problems were gone, but because they were finally being handled by someone who knew where they came from. I shut down my computer and stood up, looking around the office they'd taken and returned in less than a day. They thought the humiliation had been the removal. They were wrong. The real mistake was assuming I'd come back the same way I'd left. Once I was back in the seat, the consequences didn't stop. They spread. What had been treated as a temporary disruption revealed itself as a structural problem, and the cracks ran wider than anyone wanted to admit. Departments that had functioned smoothly for years suddenly had to justify decisions they'd never documented because they'd never needed to. People who were used to dropping issues at my door now had to explain them out loud, and in doing so, exposed how much depended on quiet judgment rather than formal process. I didn't rush to fix everything. I prioritized. Some problems needed immediate correction because the damage would compound if left alone. Others I allowed to surface fully so leadership could see them without my hand smoothing the edges. That distinction mattered. In one meeting, a senior manager argued for restoring the previous approval chain to speed things up. I asked him to explain how it had worked the day before I left. He couldn't, not clearly. He knew it functioned, but not why. That was the pattern repeating itself. Systems had been built around trust, not documentation, and when trust was removed, confusion filled the space. Adrian struggled in his new role, not because he lacked intelligence, but because he'd been positioned as an answer when he was still a question. People tested him constantly. They asked him things they knew he couldn't answer, not to embarrass him, but to understand where authority actually lived now. Each time he deferred to me, the shift became more visible. I didn't undermine him, but I didn't protect him either. This wasn't personal, it was instructional. Leadership meetings changed tone, fewer bold declarations, more cautious phrasing. I noticed who stopped speaking altogether and who started listening for the first time. The COO tried to regain narrative control by framing the disruption as a learning phase. I didn't contradict him publicly. I let results speak. Approvals resumed, bottlenecks cleared, metrics stabilized. Not dramatically, just steadily, the way they always had when I was allowed to do the work without interference. That contrast did more than any confrontation could have. Behind closed doors, conversations got sharper. I was asked how many decisions had been rerouted during my absence. I answered honestly. I was asked what risks had been narrowly avoided. I didn't speculate. I cited facts. I was asked whether this kind of disruption could happen again. That was the wrong question. I corrected it. It will, I said, unless authority matches accountability. No one argued with that. At some point, someone suggested formalizing my role further, turning what had been an operational function into a structural one. I didn't push for it. I let the idea circulate on its own. When people reach the same conclusion independently, it holds longer. Adrian adapted faster than I expected. He stopped trying to prove himself and started paying attention. He asked fewer questions in public and better ones in private. He took notes instead of taking credit. That change didn't go unnoticed. It also didn't erase what had happened. Trust, once broken, doesn't reset. It recalibrates. By the end of the week, the organization looked stable from the outside, but inside, the hierarchy had shifted. People routed decisions differently. They checked with me before committing, even when they technically didn't have to. Leadership noticed. Some welcomed it. Others resented it quietly. That resentment didn't concern me. I wasn't there to be liked. I was there to make sure the same mistake couldn't be made twice. I documented what had never been written down before, not as a favor, but as a boundary. If someone wanted to bypass me again, they'd have to do it knowingly, not casually. Late one afternoon, the COO stopped by my office without scheduling it. He stood instead of sitting. "This went further than we expected," he said. I replied, "It always does." He asked if I felt vindicated. I shook my head. "I feel corrected," I said. "So does the organization." He nodded slowly, like someone finally understanding the cost of a decision made too quickly. As he left, I watched the reflection of the floor in the glass wall, people moving with more purpose, fewer interruptions, clearer lines. The fallout wasn't dramatic anymore. It was absorbed. That was the real shift. Not the return to normal, but the establishment of something that wouldn't quietly break the next time someone decided I was optional. Weeks later, the building looked the same from the outside, but it no longer operated the same way on the inside. That was the point. The decision that had humiliated me wasn't erased or rebranded. It was absorbed into the structure as a lesson no one could claim they hadn't learned. My role was formalized in writing, not as a favor, but as a necessity. Authority was no longer implied by proximity or title. It was documented, visible, and difficult to bypass without consequence. Meetings became shorter, decisions landed faster. People stopped performing confidence and started checking facts. Adrian settled into his position without protest. He did the work he was capable of doing and stopped reaching for work he wasn't. That adjustment mattered more than any apology. Leadership never formally apologized, and I never asked them to. The acknowledgement came in other ways. Invitations I hadn't received before. Questions asked before decisions were announced. Silence when I spoke instead of interruption. Those were the markers that counted. I didn't gloat and I didn't soften. I focused on making the system resilient enough that my absence wouldn't create the same vacuum again. That wasn't generosity, it was insurance. The COO approached me once about future planning, about succession and continuity. I listened, then told him the truth. If you ever decide to replace experience with appearance again, make sure you understand what you're removing. He nodded. I couldn't tell if he was agreeing or simply recognizing that the conversation itself would have consequences now. Outside my office, people moved with more certainty. Not because they feared me, but because they understood where decisions lived. That clarity reduced tension in ways no morale initiative ever had. At the end of one long day, as the floor emptied out, I sat alone and looked around the space they had taken and returned as if it were interchangeable. It wasn't the office that mattered. It was what the office represented. Trust earned quietly. Authority built through outcomes. Leverage accumulated without announcing itself. That leverage didn't come from ambition. It came from staying long enough to see patterns others missed and fixing problems before they needed names. I thought about how easily it could have ended differently if I'd rushed back, smoothed things over, made it easy for them to frame the humiliation as a misunderstanding. That would have cost me everything they now respected. Instead, I let the consequences speak first. When they finally spoke to me, it was on terms that couldn't be walked back without effort. I left that night without fanfare, shutting off the lights, locking the door, walking past the desk where Adrian now worked without pretense. He looked up and nodded. I nodded back. That was enough. The story didn't end with revenge, it ended with recalibration. They learned what happens when you remove the person holding the structure together. I learned something too. Quiet competence only protects you as long as it's allowed to be quiet. When it's challenged publicly, the response has to be just as visible. Not louder, not cruel, just undeniable. I didn't lose my job that day, but I lost something quieter and harder to replace. The illusion that quiet competence protects you. For years, I carried the weight so others could move faster, and I let that weight stay invisible because the work got done. When they took my office, what stung wasn't the desk or the title. It was realizing how easily years of preparation could be mistaken for luck. The hours after that decision taught me a different lesson. Power doesn't always announce itself. It hides in notes you keep, decisions you document, and patience you practice when others rush. I didn't win by arguing. I won because I had receipts, patterns, and a memory of how things fail. While they debated optics, I held the map. That strength took time. It took late nights fixing problems before breakfast. It took writing things down when no one asked. It took resisting the urge to explain myself too early. The cost was real. I missed dinners. I carried stress home. I learned to sleep lightly, but the return was leverage that couldn't be copied in a hiring sprint. When the system faltered, my preparation spoke without raising my voice. That's the part people miss. Quiet power isn't passive. It's active, deliberate, and earned long before it's needed. If you recognize yourself here, don't wait for permission to be visible. Make your work legible. Keep records that tell the story you won't have time to tell later. Build patience like a muscle. When the moment comes, you won't need to demand respect. The work will do it for you. That discipline saved my family evenings later, steadied my health, and restored trust. Because clarity reduces panic and preparation, shortens crises when pressure arrives without drama or apologies for me. How to get started today. Write down decisions you make and why you made them. Keep a simple log of fixes you prevent, not just fires you fight. Make your processes visible, even if no one asks. Practice waiting before responding when pressure rises. Protect your time so preparation doesn't cost your health. What quiet work have you done that no one noticed yet? And how would it hold up when pressure hits?